The Mississippi did not flood, it attacked. April 1927, the river tore open its own veins, a wall of water crashing across the South like a living executioner. Levees, those towering monuments to human arrogance, shattered in the night, their thunder louder than war. Entire towns drowned before a scream could escape their throats. Farms vanished. Roads dissolved. The land became an ocean, and the ocean gave no mercy. 700,000 people, trapped, starving, clinging to rooftops and trees while the water swallowed everything they had ever touched. Rescue boats drifted past corpses tangled in branches. Camps built on high ground became prisons, ruled by hunger and hierarchy, where the poor and the black bore chains of silence beneath the Red Cross tents. Beneath the headlines of heroism, there was something far darker: forced labor, guarded levees, the rich saving their cotton while the poor were left to drown. And behind it all, power shifted like the river's current. Herbert Hoover rising from the floodwaters, politics soaking into the mud, the Delta bleeding its people north into the steel heart of Chicago and Detroit. This was no natural disaster. It was a reckoning, a rupture in America's spine, a wound that never closed, a river rewriting the nation by force. The Mississippi River was never simply a body of water. It was an artery, a living channel carrying the weight of half a continent, stretching from the headwaters in Minnesota to the Gulf of Mexico, draining the rains and snowmelt of 31 states. The basin was immense, covering more than 1.2 million square miles, nearly 40% of the continental United States. Every drop of rain falling on the Alleghenies, the Rockies, the Dakotas, and the rolling hills of the Midwest had a destination, and that destination was the Mississippi. It was not a river that could be escaped or ignored. It dictated the geography of life itself. The river carved out fertile floodplains, some of the richest agricultural soil in North America. For centuries, silt carried by seasonal floods replenished fields, giving rise to crops that fed cities and fueled economies. By the late 19th century, those floodplains had been transformed into the beating heart of the cotton kingdom. Plantations lined the Delta, and cotton, the cash crop that had shaped slavery before the Civil War, continued to dominate, now worked by sharecroppers bound to the land by debt and circumstance. The Mississippi was prosperity and ruin bound together. When it yielded, fortunes rose. When it raged, it swept everything away. Floods had always been part of the river's rhythm, but in the 19th century their violence became clearer, more documented, harder to ignore. The flood of 1844 was remembered as one of the largest in the early century, a wall of water covering vast sections of Missouri and Illinois. In 1851, swollen tributaries turned much of Iowa into an inland sea. The flood of 1874 inundated Arkansas, sweeping through towns with such force that entire communities were forced to higher ground. But none of these matched the scale of 1882, when a deluge swept across the lower Mississippi Valley, drowning over 50,000 square miles of land. That disaster marked a turning point. It exposed the fragility of levees hastily built by local authorities. Earthen walls often no more than compacted mud, uncoordinated, inconsistent, and easily breached. The Army Corps of Engineers had been assigned responsibility for the Mississippi as early as 1824, tasked with keeping the river navigable for commerce. By the late 19th century, their mission expanded: tame the floods, protect the cotton empire, defend commerce from nature's upheavals. The Corps embraced a doctrine that seemed absolute: the levees-only policy. They rejected the idea of spillways or floodways that would allow the river to spread out in controlled fashion. Instead, they insisted that if levees were built high enough, strong enough, and continuous enough, the river would remain obedient. Water would stay within its banks, the floods would be tamed, and civilization could expand across the Delta unchallenged. This philosophy ignored the river's own history. The Mississippi was a shifting beast, prone to carving new channels, abandoning old ones, swallowing land on one bank while depositing silt on the other. Each spring, when snowmelt from the upper Midwest poured southward, the river surged. Without room to spread, the pressure mounted. The higher the levees, the more ferocious the current, the greater the danger when those earthen walls finally cracked. Yet confidence was absolute. By the turn of the 20th century, levee boards across the South raised taxes, demanded labor, and stretched the walls higher. Local sheriffs conscripted black men, often at gunpoint, to work on the levees during flood season, piling sandbags in freezing rain, their labor unacknowledged in official reports. The levees shaped not only the geography of the river, but also the geography of human lives. Along the Mississippi Delta, cotton reigned supreme. Vast plantations depended on cheap, captive labor. After the Civil War, freedom had been granted, but opportunity had not. African American families, trapped in the cycle of sharecropping, rented land in exchange for a portion of the crop. Debt peonage bound them to the soil, their movements tightly controlled by landowners and creditors. Racial hierarchy was enforced not just by law but by geography. The levees themselves became symbols of power. White planters saw them as bulwarks of profit, while black laborers experienced them as instruments of coercion, built and repaired through sweat and threat. By 1912, the Mississippi River Commission, working under the Corps of Engineers, boasted that more than 1,500 miles of levees stretched from Cairo, Illinois, to New Orleans. The walls rose like a man-made horizon, cutting off towns from the view of the river itself. Steamships carrying timber, grain, and cotton churned along its current, their whistles echoing across the delta. Commerce was booming, the ports of Memphis, Vicksburg, Baton Rouge, and New Orleans tied by water to the markets of the world. Railroads linked river towns to inland cities, but it was the Mississippi that remained the spine of the economy. Everything depended on the flow staying contained. Yet the river gave constant reminders of its refusal to be mastered. The flood of 1912 left levees straining, though they held in most places. In 1913, torrential rains from the Ohio Valley sent walls of water into the Mississippi, breaching levees and inundating towns. In 1922, another major flood struck, forcing evacuations across Arkansas and Mississippi, killing hundreds, and eroding confidence in the system. But each time, officials insisted the answer was the same: build the levees higher, thicker, longer. There could be no compromise with the river. The human presence along the floodplain swelled in defiance of those warnings. By the 1920s, millions lived within the Mississippi Valley, many of them perched on land that had been floodplain for centuries. Cotton prices during World War I had encouraged expansion. Planters borrowed heavily to buy land and equipment, binding themselves to the river's fortunes. Towns like Greenville, Clarksdale, and Helena grew into thriving trade centers. Their banks, churches, and courthouses stood just a few miles from levees that strained each spring under the weight of distant rains. The racial order was absolute. Jim Crow laws confined African Americans to second-class citizenship, barring them from political power, economic opportunity, or fair treatment under law. In flood season, their place was on the levee, filling sacks with river sand, stacking them against the rising water. For planters, the levees were not just barriers against floods. They were insurance policies for cotton wealth, built and maintained through coerced labor. The river's geography was inseparable from the geography of inequality. By 1926, the Mississippi's waters had reached dangerous levels after months of rainfall. Tributaries like the Ohio and Arkansas carried surging flows southward, swelling the channel beyond what levees were designed to withstand. In September 1926, the first warnings sounded as the lower basin grew waterlogged. Through the winter, the rains continued, saturating soil and straining every weak point in the levee system. Engineers remained confident, assuring the public that the system was ready. Towns expanded, crops were planted, and families carried on with faith in earthworks that had never faced the true weight of a basin's wrath. The stage was set, a river carrying the lifeblood of a continent, pressed between walls of earth. An economy built on cotton, resting on borrowed land and borrowed time. A racial system that turned disaster labor into a tool of control. A government convinced that nature could be caged with shovels and sacks of sand. The Mississippi held its breath. The storm was coming. The rains began in the summer of 1926 and refused to stop. Across the Mississippi Basin, from the upper Midwest to the Ohio Valley, storms lashed the land in intervals so relentless that soil never had a chance to dry. Illinois recorded rainfall far above seasonal averages. Kentucky was battered with weeks of steady downpours. Ohio, already waterlogged by autumn, absorbed storm after storm until its rivers rose with a force that defied control. Arkansas, drained by countless tributaries feeding into the Mississippi, became a landscape of standing water. Its farmland turned into reservoirs for the river's next assault. The Mississippi River is not a single stream, but a system, and by late 1926, its tributaries were delivering torrents from every direction. The Ohio River, carrying the weight of the Alleghenies and the eastern watershed, swelled beyond its banks, feeding the Mississippi with volumes greater than any human calculation could manage. The Arkansas River surged with equal menace, pouring into the main channel with destructive energy. These tributaries acted as giant funnels, forcing the Mississippi to rise inch by inch, then foot by foot, until its surface pressed against levees along thousands of miles. By December 1926, the first warnings appeared in the form of records quietly broken. The U.S. Weather Bureau registered river stages that exceeded anything previously measured for that month. Local newspapers carried brief notes about unusual conditions upriver, but officials spoke with confidence. The Army Corps of Engineers maintained that the levee system was designed precisely for such extremes, that nothing would be breached so long as men and sandbags stood ready. Faith in engineering had become doctrine, and doctrine silenced doubt. January 1927 arrived with no reprieve. Rain swept through the Ohio Valley again, pushing the river to extraordinary levels. In Cincinnati, the Ohio River rose to nearly 80 feet, far above flood stage. Its waters pressed southward, carrying with them the pressure of an entire region's rainfall. By February, the Mississippi from Cairo, Illinois, downward resembled a river in full rebellion, straining its levees, testing every weak seam, exposing the fragility of a system that had been declared invincible. Communities along the lower valley understood the threat more viscerally than officials in Washington or engineers drafting maps. Farmers saw their fields standing underwater long before planting season. Towns along the Arkansas and Yazoo rivers found streets transformed into temporary canals. Families carried their belongings to attics, not because the river had reached them yet, but because they knew its habits, its sudden surges, its unpredictability. They had seen high water before, but never water this high, this early, and this persistent. Still, the official word was reassurance. The Mississippi River Commission, working with the Corps of Engineers, insisted the levees were strong. They cited the miles of earthworks completed since the 1880s, the improvements made after the 1912 and 1922 floods, the billions of cubic yards of dirt moved and shaped into barriers. The public was told to trust the system. Local sheriffs and levee boards demanded men, mostly poor black laborers bound by debt peonage, to patrol the embankments, stacking sandbags, plugging leaks, stamping down seepage. Their labor was compulsory, sometimes enforced with armed guards, a reminder that the racial hierarchy of the Delta was inseparable from the fight to contain the river. By March 1927, the Mississippi was swollen from Cairo to New Orleans. Its surface stretched wider than at any point in living memory. In places, the river rose 20 feet above surrounding farmland, contained only by ridges of earth that shook with the pressure. Crevasses, small leaks where water trickled through or beneath a levee, multiplied daily. Each was a warning, but each was patched with hurried labor, sandbags dumped by the thousands, timber driven into soft soil to strengthen the walls. Engineers called it routine. Locals called it a sign that the river was about to break. The numbers told a story too stark to ignore. In early 1927, rainfall across the Central Basin exceeded twice the seasonal average. The Ohio River delivered its highest discharges ever recorded up to that time. The White River, the Arkansas, the Yazoo, and countless smaller streams carried volumes that dwarfed their channels. By April, nearly every tributary feeding the lower Mississippi was in flood. The river no longer flowed as a single current, but as a system in chaos, each part driving the other to higher and more destructive levels. Communities on the front lines issued their own warnings. In Arkansas City, local officials urged reinforcement of levees, reporting water levels within inches of the top. In Greenville, Mississippi, planters demanded more workers to shore up weak spots, fearing their plantations would disappear beneath the torrent. In Louisiana, levee boards met daily, debating whether the system could withstand the pressure or whether intentional breaks might be necessary to save New Orleans by sacrificing rural parishes. Each meeting carried an unspoken acknowledgement. If the levees failed, it would not be a gradual seepage but a catastrophe, sudden and total. The pressure was relentless. Hydrologists later calculated that by April 1927, the Mississippi was carrying more water than any other flood in American history. Yet in those crucial weeks, officials clung to faith in human construction. Engineers walked the levees with clipboards and measuring rods, assuring residents that everything was under control. Newspapers published optimistic statements, warning against panic, insisting that vigilance and labor would hold the river back. Beneath the surface of this confidence was fear, the kind of fear that never made it to print but spread in whispers among those who lived nearest the water. The Mississippi did not wait. As March gave way to April, the river reached levels so high that the difference between containment and annihilation was measured in inches. In towns across Arkansas, Mississippi, and Louisiana, families listened at night to the groan of levees under strain, the sound of water pushing through soil, the distant thunder of tributaries still pouring into the main channel. Each day the water rose, and each day officials told the public it could be managed. The winter rains had done their work. They had saturated every tributary, filled every reservoir, tested every defense. By early 1927, the Mississippi River was no longer merely swollen. It was primed for collapse, its weight pressing against the man-made walls built to cage it. Levees stretched for thousands of miles, but their continuity was only as strong as their weakest link. And with every hour of rain still falling across the central basin, the river pressed harder, waiting for the inevitable fracture. On April 21, 1927, at Mounds Landing in Mississippi, the Mississippi River finally broke its cage. The levee, long considered one of the strongest in the entire delta, collapsed under the unbearable pressure. It had been built higher and thicker than most, fortified to hold against the heaviest floods. Yet when it gave way, it did not simply fail, it exploded. A roar of water surged through the breach, a torrent more than a mile wide hurling itself across the alluvial plain with the force of an unleashed ocean. In a single instant, thousands of acres of farmland, cabins, and cotton rows disappeared beneath a sheet of water that moved faster than any horse or train could outrun. The breach was catastrophic. The river poured into the Mississippi Delta with a violence that stunned even those who had lived their entire lives under the shadow of the flood. Entire towns were erased in hours. The waters expanded outward, submerging an estimated 200 square miles within the first day. By the end of that week, the flood spread so widely that maps lost their meaning. Roads vanished. County lines blurred. A landscape once divided into farms and settlements was reduced to a single inland sea. The Mounds Landing break was not an isolated collapse. It was the signal of a chain reaction. As the Mississippi surged, levees across 3 states began to falter. In Arkansas, embankments built from hastily compacted soil disintegrated under the pounding current, sending water rushing into cotton fields and towns. In Louisiana, levees along the Atchafalaya Basin strained until they split, unleashing water that surged into parishes already saturated by winter rains. In Mississippi itself, the delta became unrecognizable. What had once been some of the richest farmland in the United States was reduced to a drowned plain, rooftops barely visible above the waves. The geographic scale of the flood was almost impossible to grasp. More than 16 million acres were submerged, an area larger than all of New England combined. From Illinois to the Gulf of Mexico, the Mississippi and its tributaries spilled into the surrounding countryside. In some places, the flood stretched 70 miles across, creating an inland sea with no horizon. The water rose so high that steamboats navigated streets where wagons had once passed. In the delta, families clung to levees and rooftops as the water climbed. In towns like Greenville, Mississippi, only the tallest buildings remained above the flood line, surrounded by miles of silence broken only by the sound of rushing current. The human cost began immediately. Families had minutes, sometimes seconds, to flee rising water. Boats became lifelines, carrying men, women, and children through flooded towns where currents tore houses from their foundations and swept them downstream. livestock drowned in fields, their carcasses floating beside uprooted trees and collapsed barns. Railroads and highways, once arteries of commerce, vanished beneath the flood, cutting off entire regions. Relief was possible only by water or by the scattered airplanes that dropped food into stranded communities. The force of the Mounds Landing breach was so immense that it permanently altered the geography of the land. The silt-rich floodwaters scoured fields and buried them under new layers of mud and debris. Plantations that had taken decades to cultivate were obliterated overnight. Farmhouses built on stilts, long thought safe from the highest water, were swallowed whole. The collapse of the levee was not just an engineering failure. It was a social and economic catastrophe, wiping out the foundations of life in the Delta. The disaster spread into Louisiana with terrifying speed. As water funneled into the Atchafalaya Basin, it surged through forests and swamps, transforming them into vast lakes. In Point Capee Parish, whole communities fled to levees that became narrow islands surrounded by an endless flood. Further south, fears grew that New Orleans itself might be overwhelmed if the upriver waters were not contained. Local officials, desperate to save the city, made fateful decisions to intentionally dynamite levees south of the metropolis, sacrificing poor and rural parishes to spare the urban core. This act preserved the city but condemned tens of thousands in St. Bernard and Plaquemines parishes to permanent ruin, their lands deliberately flooded as a human buffer zone. The scope of inundation dwarfed anything Americans had ever experienced. 600,000 people were displaced, at that time the largest forced migration in U.S. history. African-American sharecroppers, who had been ordered onto levees to repair cracks with shovels and sandbags, now found themselves stranded on those same levees, marooned by water on both sides. Thousands camped in overcrowded conditions atop embankments, waiting for rescue that often never came. Towns that had once been centers of cotton wealth became refugee camps where hunger and disease spread unchecked. The Mississippi Delta was transformed from a land of promise into a waterlocked prison. Greenville, once the pride of the region, became an island. Boats carried supplies to the city, but the water trapped tens of thousands on levees surrounding it. The Red Cross established relief stations, but the scale of need dwarfed their resources. In Vicksburg, the Yazoo and Mississippi valleys merged into a single sheet of water stretching as far as the eye could measure. Arkansas endured similar devastation. One-third of the entire state was underwater at the peak of the flood. The numbers told a relentless story. The water covered an expanse stretching 27,000 square miles. More than 130,000 homes were destroyed or damaged. Railroads lost hundreds of miles of track. Entire harvests vanished beneath the flood, inflicting an economic loss estimated at hundreds of millions of dollars, a staggering sum in 1927. For African-American sharecroppers, the destruction meant more than lost homes and fields. It erased the fragile security of their lives, accelerating a migration northward that would reshape the demographics of Chicago, Detroit, and St. Louis. Everywhere the flood went, it carried with it the smell of mud, decay, and ruin. It stripped away illusions of safety, exposing the weakness of a system that had claimed to master the river. Levees that had been celebrated as triumphs of engineering became monuments to failure. The river, swollen by months of unrelenting rains, had reasserted itself with total dominance. Its waters, once thought caged, now rolled across the land without obstruction, silencing farms, towns, and cities beneath an inland sea. The collapse at Mounds Landing was the single most destructive levee failure in the history of the United States. It marked the moment the Mississippi ceased to be a controlled channel and became a weapon against the very society that sought to tame it. With each mile the water advanced, the human and geographic toll multiplied. The flood did not strike in a single blow but spread in waves, relentless, unstoppable, swallowing the delta until the map of the South itself was rewritten beneath its weight. The Great Mississippi Flood of 1927 was not only a disaster of water and levees, it was a disaster of people. Nearly 700,000 men, women, and children were displaced, a population larger than the entire city of Washington, D.C. at the time. It was the largest refugee crisis in the United States before the Second World War, and it unfolded not over weeks, but instantly. In the span of a few days, when the river poured into the delta and erased the lives built along its banks, families who had lived on the same fields for generations awoke to find their homes surrounded by water, their roads gone, their landmarks swallowed. With no warning but the roar of collapsing levees, they fled to the nearest ridge, embankment, or rooftop, carrying only what they could lift in their arms. The river showed no mercy in its advance. Boats, hastily fashioned from anything that would float, glided down streets that had been main avenues only days earlier. In Arkansas, church steeples jutted above the water like the last markers of towns already gone. In Mississippi, families huddled in the branches of trees for days, clinging to life while watching livestock drown in the fields below. Horses and mules, once the foundation of farm labor, were swept away in currents too strong for them to resist. Herds of cattle, driven onto levees in desperation, crowded into narrow strips of earth until disease and starvation set in. Survival was measured in hours and in inches of levee height. The most vulnerable bore the greatest burden. In the delta, tens of thousands of black sharecroppers had been conscripted before the levees broke, forced to pile sandbags under armed guard to hold back the river. When the water came anyway, they were left with nowhere to go but the same levees they had been ordered to defend. Stranded on those narrow ridges, surrounded on all sides by floodwaters, they endured conditions that defied description. Relief was slow, and when it arrived, it came with control. Camps were established on the embankments, many under the authority of local planters and officials. Food and shelter were distributed sparingly. Movement was restricted. For many black families, the flood was not only a natural disaster, but also an extension of Jim Crow oppression. Relief tied to forced labor, rations given in exchange for continued subservience, freedom curtailed by those who controlled supplies. The class divide was stark in every rescue. Wealthier landowners were among the first to be evacuated, their families taken to safety in boats sent directly to their homes. Cotton bales were sometimes loaded before the tenants who had picked them. In Greenville, Mississippi, the seat of Delta wealth, rescue operations prioritized the prominent planters, while their black laborers were ordered to remain on the levees to prevent panic. Officials feared that if too many African American families were allowed to leave, the plantation economy would collapse for lack of labor. Refuge was given, but only with conditions that revealed the racial and class hierarchies built into every decision of relief. For those who were rescued, the ordeal was far from over. The Red Cross, under the national direction of Herbert Hoover, established camps across the flooded region. In theory, these were places of safety, but in practice, they became sites of overcrowding, hunger, and disease. Families were packed into tents on high ground, where mud was ankle-deep and sanitation was minimal. Typhoid and influenza spread easily in the damp, confined spaces. Rations were limited, often consisting of little more than beans, flour, and salt pork. Medical care was sparse, and infant mortality rose sharply in the camps. Yet even within this suffering, distinctions were made. White refugees, though often poor and desperate, were given better accommodations and more reliable rations. Black refugees were frequently segregated into separate camps, where conditions were harsher and labor was demanded as the price of food. Testimonies from the period recorded that African American men were often forced to continue working on levee reinforcement or cleanup, even after losing their homes. Relief was conditional, survival tied to submission. The scale of displacement shattered entire communities. In Arkansas, more than one-third of the state lay underwater, displacing hundreds of thousands. In Mississippi, the delta was transformed into an inland sea, isolating Greenville, Clarksdale, and dozens of smaller towns. In Louisiana, the intentional destruction of levees to protect New Orleans condemned thousands of rural families to permanent exile, their land drowned beneath controlled flooding. Movement was constant. Families carried by boat to railheads, loaded onto trains bound for temporary camps, scattered across the South in search of higher ground. The flood scattered people like debris, dispersing them far from the homes that had anchored generations. Personal accounts painted the scale of survival. A family of 6 in Arkansas clung to a rooftop for 3 days without food until a relief boat found them, half conscious from hunger. In Mississippi, Children were tied to tree branches with rope so they would not be swept away by the current as their parents searched for rescue. Entire towns were forced to live on levees for weeks, waiting for waters that never seemed to recede. In the Delta, some families buried what possessions they could in wooden boxes, hoping to recover them when the waters withdrew. Most never did. The destruction of livestock compounded human suffering. In the rural South of 1927, animals were more than property, they were survival. When the water came, tens of thousands of cattle, pigs, and mules were swept away, their bloated carcasses fouling the floodwaters and spreading disease. For sharecroppers who owned little but their labor, the loss of a mule meant the loss of the next year's livelihood. For planters, the drowning of herds meant financial ruin. The flood erased the foundation of agricultural life, stripping bare the fragile economy that had sustained the Delta for decades. The refugee crisis also accelerated a shift already underway. Many African American families who endured the camps and the harshness of levee control did not return to the plantations once the waters receded. Instead, they joined the Great Migration northward, heading for Chicago, Detroit, and St. Louis. The flood had destroyed their homes, but it had also destroyed the illusion of permanence in the Delta. The labor system that had bound them to cotton fields was weakened by the sheer scale of displacement. The migration that reshaped northern cities gained new momentum from the chaos of 1927. Yet at the height of the disaster, survival left no time for decisions about the future. In the spring of 1927, the floodwaters ruled everything. Refugees lined the levees in numbers too great to count, stretching for miles. Entire populations balanced on thin ridges of earth above an ocean of brown water. Boats moved ceaselessly between the stranded and the camps, carrying the sick, the hungry, the desperate. Relief trains rattled south with supplies, but every delivery was a fraction of the need. The Mississippi had displaced not just individuals, but entire societies, forcing hundreds of thousands into a state of suspension, neither home nor safe, neither free nor secure, waiting for the river to give back what it had taken. When the Mississippi River swallowed the South in 1927, the disaster outgrew local relief within days. It demanded national coordination, money, and organization on a scale the United States had never attempted in peacetime. Into that void stepped the American Red Cross, led by Herbert Hoover, then Secretary of Commerce. On May 2, 1927, President Calvin Coolidge appointed Hoover to head the national relief effort, a decision that turned a catastrophe into a stage for a man whose ambitions reached far beyond floodwaters. Hoover saw in the disaster not only a humanitarian crisis, but also an opportunity to prove the effectiveness of centralized, business-like administration, and to cement his own reputation as the nation's indispensable problem solver. The Red Cross mobilized quickly, transforming the flood zone into a network of refugee camps, supply lines, and medical outposts. By late spring, nearly 325,000 people were officially housed in camps, though the number of displaced was twice that. The official reports painted a picture of order: neat rows of tents, food lines operating smoothly, medical staff attentive to every need. Newspapers carried photographs of Hoover touring the flooded areas, surrounded by officials, his presence symbolizing calm in chaos. Donations poured in from across the country. Millions of dollars raised through appeals that framed the disaster as a national tragedy demanding collective action. But behind the photographs and reports lay a harsher reality. The camps were overcrowded from the beginning, straining under the weight of too many bodies and too few resources. Sanitation was minimal, with latrines overflowing and clean water scarce. Diseases such as dysentery, influenza, and pneumonia spread quickly in the damp conditions. Rations, often little more than beans, rice, and cornbread, could not meet the nutritional needs of families who had lost everything. Relief workers on the ground recorded the misery, but their accounts rarely matched the optimistic bulletins issued from Washington. The gap between image and reality widened with every week the floodwaters lingered. Race determined survival as much as geography. African Americans made up the majority of the displaced, over 2/3 of those forced into camps, but their treatment was vastly different from that of white refugees. In many camps, black families were segregated into separate quarters, often the least sanitary and most overcrowded sections. While white refugees were generally free to leave when they found relatives or work elsewhere, black refugees were frequently detained on the levees or in camps by local officials and planters who feared that if laborers left, the cotton economy would collapse. The flood thus reinforced the racial order of the Jim Crow South, even as it destroyed the physical landscape. Reports of forced labor surfaced almost immediately. In the Greenville, Mississippi camp, the largest in the Delta, thousands of African Americans were held under armed guard. They were required to perform heavy labor, unloading supplies, reinforcing levees, clearing debris, and even serving white families housed in better quarters. Testimonies later collected revealed that men who refused were threatened with violence or denial of rations. Relief became a tool of coercion, food and shelter exchanged for submission. The plantation elite, many of whom had lost vast tracts of farmland to the flood, used the camps to reassert control over a displaced workforce. The National Red Cross leadership, including Hoover, was aware of the complaints but careful in response. Publicly, the organization maintained that camps were orderly and humane, dismissing reports of abuse as isolated incidents or exaggerations. Privately, officials acknowledged tensions but justified strict control as necessary to maintain discipline. For Hoover, image was paramount. He cultivated the press carefully, ensuring that stories highlighted his efficiency and compassion. He was portrayed as the engineer of salvation, the man who had organized relief for Belgium during World War I and was now doing the same for the Mississippi Valley. The suffering of refugees, particularly African Americans, rarely appeared in this narrative. The flood revealed the hard boundaries of racial inequality in relief work. African American leaders, including Robert Moton of Tuskegee Institute, were invited by Hoover to lend credibility to the effort. Moton toured the camps and later reported to Hoover that conditions for black refugees were intolerable. His private report described forced labor, inadequate rations, and the denial of freedom of movement. But Hoover persuaded Moton not to release the findings publicly, arguing that it would harm the relief campaign and inflame racial tensions. Instead, the official account stressed cooperation and progress, while the realities of mistreatment remained buried. In the camps, daily life reflected the divide. White refugees often received clothing donations first, leaving black families with whatever remained. Medical attention was prioritized for whites, while black children suffered higher rates of malnutrition and disease. Work assignments fell disproportionately on African Americans, who had little choice but to comply. Even burial practices underscored inequality. When flood victims died in the camps, white bodies were often claimed and buried properly, while black victims were buried in mass graves without ceremony. The sheer scale of the relief effort magnified every injustice. Over 16 million acres were submerged, spanning Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana, and beyond. More than 700,000 displaced people required assistance, and the Red Cross became the sole authority over their survival. The organization distributed food, blankets, and medicine, but always through the filter of local white control. Planters frequently acted as intermediaries, determining who among the refugees in their districts received aid. This system ensured that loyalty was rewarded and independence punished. For black sharecroppers, the camps were less a refuge than a continuation of servitude, now enforced not only by local sheriffs, but also by the national machinery of relief. Hoover's role cannot be separated from the politics of the disaster. He recognized that his visibility in the relief campaign could propel him toward the presidency, and every decision was made with that in mind. He visited the Delta repeatedly, escorted by journalists and photographers, but his tours were carefully staged. He met with prominent planters and local officials, not with the black refugees who made up the majority of those suffering. His speeches emphasized national unity and progress, avoiding any mention of racial inequality. By the end of 1927, his reputation as the great humanitarian was secure, and he would ride that image into the 1928 presidential election. Yet the flood itself left scars that no publicity could erase. For African Americans in the South, the experience of the camps confirmed what they already knew, that their lives were valued less, their labor demanded more, and their freedom tightly controlled. Many who endured the camps chose not to return to the plantations once the waters receded. Instead, they joined the growing migration northward, seeking lives where survival was not tied to submission. The flood had revealed in raw form the structures of power in the South. Nature destroyed homes, but man preserved hierarchy. The 1927 flood was thus both a natural and a human disaster. The Red Cross fed and sheltered hundreds of thousands, but it did so through a system that reinforced racial inequality. Hoover gained national prominence, but at the cost of burying the truth of what refugees endured. The official photographs showed tents, flags, and orderly lines, but the unrecorded reality was hunger, disease, and forced labor. Relief was given, but only on terms dictated by those already in power. The water receded, but the memory of control and inequality lingered long after the Mississippi returned to its banks. The flood of 1927 was never just about water. It was about power, who had it, who wanted it, and who was willing to reshape the nation's politics to claim it. At the center stood Herbert Hoover, the Secretary of Commerce, a man already known for organizing food relief in war-torn Europe, now thrust into the greatest natural disaster in American history. When President Calvin Coolidge appointed him on May 2, 1927, to lead the national relief effort, Hoover understood immediately that this was more than a humanitarian mission. It was a stage, vast and unavoidable, on which he could project an image of competence, authority, and compassion. In the drowned fields of the Mississippi Valley, he saw the path to the presidency. He moved quickly, transforming the crisis into a tightly managed operation that bore his stamp at every level. He coordinated the Red Cross, the Army Corps of Engineers, local officials, and private donors, positioning himself as the indispensable figure who kept chaos at bay. His visits to the flood zone were carefully staged, reported in newspapers across the country. Photographs showed him standing in boats surveying the waters, surrounded by generals and engineers, his expression calm and commanding. Stories emphasized his tireless work ethic, often noting how he stayed awake through the night in makeshift offices, issuing orders by telegraph. The reality was more complex, but the image worked. Behind Hoover's rise, local politicians and planters in the South were fighting their own battle. The destruction was immense. 16 million acres underwater, hundreds of towns uninhabitable, and a regional economy brought to its knees. Governors, mayors, and plantation elites demanded federal assistance, but their demands were laced with self-interest. They wanted money to rebuild levees, credit to restore plantations, and guarantees that their control over black laborers would not be undermined by the chaos of displacement. For decades, Southern planters had resisted federal intrusion into their affairs, but the scale of the flood forced them to reconsider. They needed Washington's resources, but they wanted those resources funneled through existing power structures, through the banks, county sheriffs, and plantation bosses who defined the political order of the Delta. Hoover recognized this tension and exploited it. He assured planters that relief would not dismantle their authority while presenting himself to Northern audiences as the architect of modern, centralized disaster management. In Greenville, Mississippi, one of the largest refugee centers, Hoover struck a deal with the elite white landowners. They would control the distribution of aid, but under the supervision of the Red Cross. This arrangement preserved the planter hierarchy while binding them to Hoover's leadership. It was a calculated compromise, appeasing local power brokers while demonstrating national authority. The flood became the backdrop for a larger debate that was already brewing in Washington. Who should control disaster relief? Until 1927, natural disasters were considered local or state responsibilities, supplemented occasionally by charity. The federal government's role was minimal, often limited to providing military engineers or small grants. But the Mississippi River flood was too vast for state governments or private charities to handle. The Red Cross, nominally a private organization, became the central relief agency only because Hoover forced it into that role, backed by presidential authority and his own relentless publicity campaign. Critics began asking whether disaster relief should remain dependent on voluntary donations or be institutionalized as a federal responsibility. Congress debated flood control measures with renewed urgency. The Flood Control Act of 1928, which authorized the Army Corps of Engineers to take unprecedented responsibility for levee construction and river management, was a direct consequence of the disaster. The act represented a fundamental shift. For the first time, the federal government assumed primary responsibility for controlling the Mississippi River. But that shift was not immediate. In 1927, the question remained unsettled, and Hoover's ability to manage the crisis gave him a platform to argue that efficiency and order came not from state governments or scattered charities, but from coordinated national leadership. Hoover's political instincts were acute. He understood that the American public was witnessing the first truly national natural disaster, one that stretched across state lines and dominated headlines for months. He framed his leadership not only as relief for the South, but as a demonstration of what America could achieve when led by capable, modern administrators. He avoided the language of partisanship, presenting himself as above politics, even while every decision he made was infused with political calculation. By the summer of 1927, newspaper editorials across the country were already describing him as the natural successor to Coolidge. The Southern elite, however, did not see themselves as mere pawns in Hoover's rise. They used the disaster to press Washington for long-term investment in flood control. The Mississippi River Commission, created in the 19th century to oversee the river, had long struggled with inadequate funding and a patchwork of local levee boards. Planters and governors argued that without massive federal investment, the Delta economy would collapse permanently. They lobbied Congress for billions in levee construction, invoking not only their own suffering but also the national stakes. The Mississippi carried grain, cotton, and commerce vital to the entire economy. Their argument worked. The flood transformed what had been a regional issue into a national priority. But the politics of race lay beneath every discussion. Southern planters insisted that federal aid be delivered through them, ensuring that displaced black sharecroppers remained tied to their plantations. Local sheriffs and National Guard units enforced this system, often preventing black refugees from leaving camps without permission. Hoover, aware of these practices, chose not to challenge them. He believed that confronting racial inequality in the relief system would alienate Southern white leaders and jeopardize his national image of unity and competence. Thus, the political bargain of 1927 was struck. The South received federal resources without federal interference in its racial order, and Hoover secured the loyalty of powerful planters while maintaining his spotless national image. The flood also forced Washington to confront the limitations of relying on private charity for national crises. The Red Cross, under Hoover's direction, raised millions of dollars, but the scale of need far outstripped donations. At its height, the organization was feeding over 600,000 people, a staggering number for what was technically a voluntary agency. Critics argued that no charity, no matter how well organized, could manage a disaster of such magnitude. Though the debate would not be resolved in 1927, the seeds were planted for a new understanding of federal responsibility in disasters, seeds that would later grow into agencies like FEMA in the 20th century. By autumn, as the floodwaters receded and political conventions loomed, Hoover emerged as the undisputed victor of the disaster, not in terms of human suffering, which remained immense, but in terms of political capital. Southern elites secured promises of federal levee construction. Congress prepared to expand flood control on a scale never seen before, and Hoover's name was on the lips of party leaders as the man who had mastered chaos. His relief campaign became the cornerstone of his 1928 presidential campaign, a narrative of competence built on the wreckage of the Mississippi Valley. The flood of 1927 thus did more than reshape landscapes. It reshaped American politics. It forced a reckoning over the role of the federal government, cemented Hoover's rise to national power, and revealed the enduring grip of local elites determined to preserve their authority even in the midst of ruin. Every levee that failed, every town submerged, and every refugee camp established became part of a larger struggle, not only against the Mississippi River, but over who would command the future of the South and, by extension, the nation itself. The Mississippi River flood of 1927 did not only wash away homes, fields, and towns. It eroded the foundations of a social order that had seemed immovable for generations. When the levees broke and the Delta drowned, thousands of African American families who had long been tied to plantations through sharecropping and debt peonage seized the moment to leave. Their departure was not sudden, not a single wave of flight, but an acceleration of an ongoing current, the Great Migration, that had already been reshaping Black life in America since World War I. The flood acted as both a push and a revelation, showing in stark, merciless detail the fragility of life in the Jim Crow South. In the immediate aftermath of the disaster, refugee camps swelled with over 600,000 displaced people. More than half were African Americans, many of them sharecroppers who had lost everything when the waters swallowed their cabins and fields. Officially, relief agencies insisted that order was being maintained, that camps provided safety and sustenance. In reality, many Black refugees endured hunger, overcrowding, and forced labor. Armed guards and local sheriffs often prevented them from leaving, fearing that planters would lose their workforce if laborers escaped northward. Yet, even under surveillance and constraint, the idea of leaving began to spread like a quiet fire. Families who had been bound to plantations for decades began looking northward with new urgency. Letters flowed from Chicago, Detroit, and St. Louis, carried back by neighbors who had already made the move in the years before the flood. Those letters spoke of jobs in steel mills, stockyards, and auto factories, of schools where Black children could advance without the constant shadow of white supremacy, of wages that, while still limited, offered more independence than the cotton fields of Mississippi ever could. Recruiters for northern industries, who had once traveled south openly during World War I, found their work made easier by the flood. The Delta had become a place of ruin. An opportunity elsewhere appeared as the only alternative. Between 1927 and the early 1930s, tens of thousands of African Americans left the flood zone. The exact numbers are difficult to calculate, but the shift was unmistakable. Towns along the Illinois Central Railroad, which ran from the Mississippi Delta straight into Chicago, saw trains fill with families carrying their belongings in sacks and crates, some clutching musical instruments, others nothing more than clothing and a Bible. The symbolism was powerful. The same line that carried cotton to northern markets now carried the very people who had cultivated that cotton. For the planters who had long depended on cheap, coerced labor, the exodus was alarming. The cotton economy, already weakened by falling prices in the 1920s, began to fray further as plantations lost their workforce. Mechanization of cotton picking was still in its infancy. It would not become widespread until after World War II. In 1927, the system still relied almost entirely on human labor. Every family that boarded a northbound train meant acres of fields that would go untended. The Delta's ruling class fought to keep Black workers in place, lobbying Hoover and the Red Cross to maintain control within the camps. But the waters had broken more than levees. They had broken illusions of permanence. The migration reshaped northern cities as well. In Chicago, where the Black population had already surged after World War I, the flood years added another wave. Neighborhoods such as the South Side expanded rapidly, giving rise to cultural institutions, churches, and businesses that would define Black urban life for decades. In Detroit, the auto industry absorbed new arrivals, swelling the ranks of Black workers at Ford and General Motors plants. St. Louis, long a border city between North and South, became another critical destination, its Black neighborhoods growing denser and more politically assertive. But memory of the flood traveled north with the migrants. In their stories, the waters of 1927 became more than a natural disaster. They became a metaphor for oppression, displacement, and survival. The flood entered blues music almost immediately. Charlie Patton, a Delta blues pioneer, recorded High Water Everywhere in 1929, his rough, urgent voice carrying the story of a world submerged. His lyrics spoke of the impossibility of escape, of waters chasing people from town to town, of the desperation that had defined those months. Bessie Smith recorded Backwater Blues in 1927, a song that, though written before the Great Flood, was forever associated with it, capturing the sorrow of lives uprooted by forces beyond control. Music turned catastrophe into collective memory, a way of narrating pain and resilience for those who lived it and those who heard it far from the Delta. Literature, too, absorbed the flood's imprint. Richard Wright, who was a young boy in Mississippi when the waters came, later drew upon the atmosphere of dislocation and struggle in his writings about the South. William Faulkner, whose fictional Yoknapatawpha County mirrored the Mississippi landscape, wrote of floods as metaphors for human frailty and the crushing force of history. In folklore, stories of the 1927 floods circulated for generations, told in cabins and churches, passed on to children as warnings about both the river and the society that had trapped them on its banks. The cultural memory carried a dual edge. For African Americans who had left, it was a reminder of what they had escaped. A South where disaster revealed the cruelty of a system that cared more for cotton than for human lives. For those who remained, it was a reminder of vulnerability, a sense that their existence could be swept away with no protection from the state and no justice in the aftermath. In either case, the flood became a permanent part of the mental landscape, shaping how people thought about mobility, survival, and the meaning of freedom. The economic effects rippled through the South long after the waters receded. The loss of labor pushed some planters toward new strategies, hiring white tenants, mechanizing small aspects of cultivation, or consolidating farms into larger, more capital-intensive units. But none of these could fully replace the sharecroppers who had left. The cotton economy, once the unquestioned foundation of the Mississippi Delta, began to show cracks that would widen over the next decades. The migration not only reduced the workforce, but also undercut the political dominance of planters, whose ability to control elections and labor alike depended on a captive population. Each trainload of migrants weakened their grip. At the same time, the migration contributed to a redefinition of Black identity in the United States. Those who left carried Southern traditions of faith, music, and community into the urban North, blending them with new influences and creating forms of expression that reshaped American culture. The blues, gospel, and later jazz and rhythm and blues all bore traces of the flood experience, the memory of water rising and lives uprooted. The cultural resonance ensured that the disaster would never be forgotten, even by those who had not lived through it. The Mississippi flood of 1927 was therefore more than a moment of destruction. It was a turning point in the movement of people, in the collapse of an economic order, and in the creation of a cultural memory that endured long after the river returned to its banks. The waters carried with them not only silt and ruin, but an irreversible momentum. Families left with no guarantee of success, but with the certainty that staying meant continued subjugation. Songs carried the story into the future, embedding the flood in the very fabric of American history. Every train that left the Delta, every verse sung in a northern club, every field left untended was a continuation of the river's force, shaping a new map of migration, labor, and memory across the nation. The Mississippi River flood of 1927 had left the nation with no illusions about the power of water. Entire towns had been obliterated, 27,000 square miles submerged, nearly 1 million people displaced. The devastation was not just physical, it was political, economic, psychological. Washington could not ignore what had happened. For decades, the Army Corps of Engineers had promised that the levee system was unbreakable, that the river could be confined by earth and stone. The levee-only policy, in place since the mid-19th century, had been treated almost as doctrine. The flood shattered that doctrine. By May 1928, Congress passed the Flood Control Act, a piece of legislation born directly out of the chaos of 1927, committing the United States to the largest and most ambitious public works project in its history. The Flood Control Act of 1928 authorized a sweeping system of levees, spillways, floodways, and reservoirs, an engineering vision unlike anything the world had seen. The Mississippi River and Tributaries Project became the blueprint. No longer would the federal government leave flood control to states, counties, or private levee boards. Washington claimed authority, placing responsibility in the hands of the Army Corps of Engineers, backed by federal funds on an unprecedented scale. The act did more than allocate money. It marked a fundamental shift in the relationship between the federal government and the land itself. For the first time, the Mississippi was to be managed as a single, integrated system, its floods restrained by human design. The stakes were enormous. The plan called for 1,500 miles of levees, reinforced and extended from Cairo, Illinois, to the Gulf of Mexico. It envisioned massive spillways, engineered escape valves for the river, where floodwaters could be diverted into designated basins rather than bursting through levees at random. The Bonnet Care spillway near New Orleans was among the first, completed in 1931, a colossal concrete structure that could divert water into Lake Pontchartrain whenever the Mississippi threatened to rise too high. Further north, engineers began work on the Bird's Point, New Madrid floodway in Missouri, designed to absorb excess flows before they could overwhelm the lower delta. Reservoirs and cutoffs were plotted, carving artificial shortcuts to force the river into a straighter, faster course. Every mile of river was studied, surveyed, mapped, and bent to the logic of engineering. The federal government poured money into the project with a determination fueled by both fear and ambition. The act appropriated $325 million, a staggering sum for its time, equivalent to billions today. Engineers believed they were not simply building protection but creating permanence, a solution that would finally tame the river once and for all. In their view, nature's unpredictability could be reduced to equations, blueprints, and reinforced concrete. The flood of 1927 had revealed the cost of failure. The Mississippi River and Tributaries Project promised a new order of control. Yet even as the system took shape, unintended consequences emerged. Levees, while preventing routine floods, narrowed the river's channel, increasing the speed and volume of water. Each mile of strengthened levee pushed the flood problem downstream, concentrating pressure on other points of weakness. Spillways offered relief, but at the cost of flooding designated lands, often belonging to poor farmers who had little political recourse. The Bird's Point, New Madrid floodway, for instance, required the displacement of entire communities, sacrificed so that cities like Cairo and Memphis might remain dry. To protect one region meant deliberately inundating another. The promise of security was uneven, shaped by geography and politics. The act also cemented federal authority in ways that redefined American governance. Before 1927, disaster relief and flood control were largely local responsibilities. The Red Cross, private charities, and state governments carried the burden. After 1928, the federal government became the central actor. Washington decided where levees would rise, where spillways would open, whose land would be sacrificed. The river became a national problem, its management a test of federal power. Herbert Hoover, who had built his presidential campaign in 1928 on his image as master of the flood relief effort, now saw his administration preside over the largest expansion of federal engineering authority in U.S. history. The Mississippi River and Tributaries Project succeeded in its immediate goal. The lower Mississippi has not witnessed a flood on the scale of 1927 since the system was completed. Spillways have opened multiple times. Bonnet Care in 1937, 1973, 2011, and beyond, proving that water can be redirected, at least temporarily. Towns that once lived in constant fear of inundation were granted decades of relative security. Farmers and industrialists alike built with new confidence, convinced the river had been finally subdued. The memory of the 1927 disaster receded in public consciousness, replaced by faith in engineering. But success carried with it a different danger: overconfidence. By containing floods within a narrowed channel, the system increased the river's destructive potential should levees ever fail. When the Mississippi swelled again in 1973, the Corps of Engineers was forced to open both the Bonnet Care and the Morganza Spillway, flooding thousands of acres of farmland to save Baton Rouge and New Orleans. In 2011, the same system was tested to its limits, with multiple spillways opened simultaneously for the first time. Each time, the flood control project worked, but always at the cost of sacrificing designated lands, often poor rural communities, to protect urban centers. The river had not been conquered, only redirected. Environmental consequences compounded over time. By forcing the Mississippi into a fixed channel, levees prevented the river from spreading silt and sediment across its natural floodplain. This deprived Louisiana's wetlands of the very material that had built them over millennia. Coastal erosion accelerated, leaving New Orleans and the Gulf Coast more vulnerable to hurricanes. The same levees that promised protection against floods indirectly weakened defenses against storms. Engineering had solved one problem while creating another, less visible but equally catastrophic. The Mississippi River and Tributaries Project became a symbol of both human ingenuity and human hubris. It demonstrated the capacity of the federal government to mobilize resources on a scale unmatched in peacetime, to transform geography itself in the name of security. But it also revealed the limits of control, the impossibility of mastering a river that drains 41% of the continental United States. Every spillway opening, every floodway activation, was a reminder that the system did not eliminate floods. It managed them, shifting their burden according to decisions made in Washington and carried out by the Corps of Engineers. The Flood Control Act of 1928 was therefore more than a piece of legislation. It was the rewriting of the Mississippi itself. Where once the river carved its own course, meandering, flooding, retreating, now it was straightened, confined, and monitored. The South was reshaped in the process. Towns that had lived with seasonal floods reoriented their economies around the promise of protection. Farmers planted with greater confidence, cities expanded, industries invested. But beneath that confidence lay a new dependence, not on the river's cycles, but on the federal government's capacity to control them. The 1927 flood had revealed the fragility of human settlements before the force of nature. The 1928 Act responded with ambition, constructing the most extensive flood control system in the world. Success followed, but so did new vulnerabilities, hidden beneath the weight of concrete and earthworks. The river was not silenced. It was only bound, waiting, its power compressed within walls built by human hands.